Welcome to my channel, Vibes of Life. In today's video, we're about to uncover something most people have never been told. It's not a secret hidden in dark corners or buried under conspiracy. It's been right there in the open, tucked between the lines of Scripture. And yet, almost no one sees it for what it truly is. But Satan does, and he hates it. This one verse, this quiet, overlooked line, is like a blade through shadow, and when it's spoken, the enemy recoils. It all began with a story, not from ancient times, but from a small, forgotten village in northern England during the years following World War II. A quiet town blanketed by grief, where loss lived in every home and questions haunted every soul. One man in particular, a young theologian named Thomas Albridge, returned from war not only with wounds on his body, but with something darker clinging to his spirit. He had seen death too closely, stared into silence too long, and now something unseen walked with him, whispering in his ear, tightening its grip around his hope. Thomas had once been full of faith, a student of Scripture, a believer in goodness. But the things he'd seen in war, what man could do to man, and how silent heaven had seemed, shook him. He started to withdraw, first from prayer, then from people, finally even from the Word. And in that growing silence, something crept in, something that fed off despair, something that hated the light. One late night, pacing alone in the church library, Thomas stumbled upon a sermon, not by a pastor of his time, but by a man he barely knew, Clive Staples Lewis. The page was yellowed, the ink faded, but one passage stood out as if it were glowing. Lewis wrote of a single verse, a sentence so drenched in truth that no evil could bear its sound, not because it was loud, but because it was true, a verse that reminded the darkness of a promise it couldn't undo. And when Thomas read it aloud that night, something changed. Now, what was that verse? Why does Satan hate it more than any other? Why is it that even seasoned believers overlook it, missing the very weapon that could silence their torment? And more importantly, why did Lewis, of all people, leave clues to it in his lesser-known works, hidden in metaphor, guarded by parable? This story isn't just about ancient words. It's about your battle, your doubt, your fear, your moments of silence when you wonder if you're alone in the fight. What if the answer has been with you all along, in a verse no one talks about? But the enemy never forgets. Stay with me, because what Thomas found that night didn't just shake the shadows off his life. It ignited a chain of events that would draw in scholars, skeptics, even spiritual forces that had long remained silent until now. What happened next still cannot be explained. And as you'll soon see, neither can the way the verse vanished from every copy of that sermon except one. Are you ready to hear the verse that darkness dreads? Because once you do, nothing stays the same. The morning after Thomas read the verse, something felt different in the air. Not better, just different. The sun was out, but it didn't warm him. The wind whispered through the trees in ways that felt more like warnings than breezes. And that old church, usually silent and comforting, suddenly seemed to watch him. He tried to tell himself it was just the lack of sleep, the memories from the war catching up with him again. But deep down, he knew that wasn't it. Something had stirred, not just in his mind, but in the unseen world around him. He returned to the church library, hoping to find that same sermon again, maybe to reread the verse, maybe to convince himself it was all in his imagination. But when he opened the drawer where he'd left the page, it was gone, not misplaced, not misfiled. Gone. The entire stack of old sermons was still there, each one in the same brittle folder it had always been in, but the one written by C.S. Lewis, the one with that strange, glowing passage, missing. Thomas stood there frozen, not sure whether to feel afraid or angry. Who else even knew about those files? No one had been in that library for weeks, and even if someone had come in, why? Take that specific page. He could still see the sentence in his mind, though it was starting to blur, like a dream just before waking. But the effect it had on him was unforgettable. When he spoke it aloud the night before, it felt as if the air itself had shifted, like some ancient bell had been rung far off in the distance, too faint for most to hear, but not for the ones it threatened. That's when the dreams started. Each night, Thomas would lie down exhausted, and each night he'd see the same figure in his sleep, tall, veiled in smoke, standing in a scorched field. No face, no voice, just a presence. And each time the figure would raise a hand as if to silence him, whispering one line over and over again. Do not speak it again. At first, Thomas didn't connect it to the verse, but when the figure appeared in the daylight behind him in the mirror, he knew he had found something powerful, and he wasn't the only one who knew it. What was it about that verse that made the enemy tremble? Why would darkness go so far to silence it, even erase it from paper? And if it's that dangerous to evil, why has almost no one ever heard it? What Thomas did next would uncover a hidden trail buried in Lewis's unpublished journals and lead him straight into the hands of something that didn't want the truth revealed. Thomas couldn't sleep anymore. Every time he closed his eyes, that same voice echoed. Do not speak it again. It was no longer just a dream. The presence was following him, not in body, but in feeling. The kind of weight you can't see but always sense. His hands trembled when he turned the pages of scripture. The verse. It was slipping from his memory. Each day, fewer words came back. It was like something was trying to erase it from inside him. But deep within, he still remembered how it felt when he spoke it, how the fear lifted, how the shadows paused. That feeling gave him the strength to keep digging. He found a letter in one of the older archives of the church. It was addressed not to a congregation, but to a personal friend of C.S. Lewis. The handwriting was familiar, sharp, clear, precise. Lewis wrote about a single line, often dismissed, yet spoken with power beyond understanding. He warned of its misuse. Not because it was dangerous to people, but because it drew attention. The kind of attention no believer seeks. Forces that watch from the silence, waiting for someone to speak truth too clearly. And Lewis wasn't the only one who knew. In a nearby village, Thomas met an elderly woman named Margaret, who had once studied under a student of Lewis. She claimed the verse was part of a set, verses buried in parables, known only to a few. Each one a key. Each one, when spoken aloud in faith, awakened something the enemy couldn't bear to hear. But even Margaret refused to say the verse out loud. Her hands shook just recalling it. She whispered, "Some things the enemy forgets, but not this." That's when Thomas realized he wasn't just remembering the verse, he was being hunted because of it. The rain hadn't stopped in 3 days. Cold, endless sheets of water hammered the village, and Thomas barely left the old rectory anymore. He had gathered pages from Lewis's forgotten writings, letters, footnotes from dusty theological journals, anything that mentioned the verse or hinted at its power. Patterns began to form. It wasn't just one verse. It was like a thread woven through different parts of Scripture, hidden in plain sight, but when spoken in the right sequence, it formed a spiritual weapon. And now something was trying to stop him from putting the pieces together. Strange things started happening around him. His Bible went missing, then reappeared, soaking wet, pages warped, stuck together. The power flickered every night at exactly 3:03 a.m. Footsteps echoed in the halls when no one else was there. But the most disturbing thing was the figure, no longer just in mirrors or dreams. It was outside, standing across the field at night, watching from the tree line. It never moved, never spoke. But the longer it stayed, the heavier the air grew. Even the birds stopped flying near the church. Thomas began to feel the pressure in his chest every time he got close to speaking the verse out loud. Something was closing in. Margaret had warned him, "It won't stop you from finding the truth. It'll just make you too afraid to speak it." But fear wasn't what held him back now. It was the knowing, deep and certain, that once he said it again, the final door would open. Whatever had been watching would cross that line. On the fourth night, the knocking started. Software rhythmic, 3 knocks. Pause, 3 more. Thomas stood in the center of the room, clutching the half-remembered verse, breathing like a hunted man. Then the doorknob slowly began to turn. Thomas didn't move. His eyes locked on the doorknob as it turned, slowly, deliberately, like whoever was on the other side wanted him to know they were there. The old wooden door creaked slightly under the pressure, but it didn't open, just a turn, and then silence. No footsteps, no voice, just that thick, choking stillness that seemed to crawl up his spine. He took a slow step back, never turning his gaze away, the paper in his hand damp with sweat. That verse. It was still incomplete. Something was missing. 1 line, maybe even 1 word. And it was that missing piece that kept him trapped in this in-between, seen by the darkness, but not yet armed against it. He waited nearly an hour before daring to open the door. No one was there, but something had been left on the floor. A book, ancient, bound in cracked leather and cold to the touch. It wasn't from his collection. He'd never seen it before. No title. Just a strange symbol on the front, a circle with 3 broken arrows pointed inward. Inside, in small, tight handwriting, was a note. "He who seeks the verse without understanding its cost will be devoured by the truth it reveals." The handwriting matched something Thomas had seen in one of Lewis's private journal pages, except this entry had never been published. How was it here? How did whoever, or whatever, leave it behind? He flipped through the pages, and in between faded theology and riddles about spiritual warfare, he found something chilling. Names, dozens of them, all scribbled hastily, all marked with a cross through the middle. Some were underlined in red, and at the bottom of the page, Thomas Albridge. His knees went weak. He hadn't told anyone about this search. No one knew the full extent of what he'd found, except Margaret. But when he tried to call her, her line was dead. He grabbed his coat and rushed to her cottage through the storm. The windows were dark. The front door hung open slightly, swaying in the wind. Inside, the place was wrecked. Papers torn, furniture overturned. No sign of Margaret. But on the floor, in the middle of the room, burned into the wood, was the same symbol from the book. And next to it, in Margaret's shaking handwriting, "They found me. Do not speak the verse. Not yet. You're not alone. But not all who help you are on your side." Then came another knock, from inside the house. Thomas froze. The knock echoed again, 3 short raps from somewhere inside Margaret's dark cottage. He turned slowly, heart pounding, eyes scanning the shadowed corners of the room. The place was still, silent, but the air had shifted. That same heaviness he felt when he first spoke, the verse had returned, only stronger now, pressing against his chest, like unseen hands. He stepped cautiously into the hallway, gripping the book tightly. The final page had fallen open, and there, scribbled faintly in red ink, was the last line of the verse. The missing piece. He read it silently, and the full verse lit up in his mind like fire through fog. Another knock, this time closer, then a whisper. "Speak it and lose everything. Stay silent, and they take it all." Thomas stepped into the living room, where a figure now stood in the doorway. Smoke clung to its outline like fog around a dying flame. It wasn't the same shadow he'd seen before. This one had a face, familiar, smiling. It was his own. The figure spoke in his voice, low and calm. "You searched for truth. You found it. But truth isn't always freedom. Sometimes it's a door that only opens inward." Its eyes glowed faintly red, flickering like embers. "Speak the verse, Thomas. But no, something will answer." Thomas tightened his grip on the book. He had come too far, watched too much fall apart. Margaret was gone. He couldn't let fear decide anymore. He closed his eyes, drew in a breath, and spoke the verse out loud. Every word clear and full of faith. The house shook. Wind screamed through the windows. The figure screamed with it, its form unraveling into ash, howling in fury as it vanished in a sudden burst of light. The weight lifted. The air cleared. Silence returned. It was over, or so he thought. He turned to leave, but froze. On the mirror above the fireplace, words had appeared, written in fog from the inside. "You didn't banish it. You became its vessel." And in his reflection, his eyes glowed faintly red. Thomas stared at his reflection, heart pounding. The red glow faded slowly from his eyes like a dying ember, but not completely. It left behind a trace, a flicker that didn't quite go away. He stepped back from the mirror, unsure whether to feel fear or something else entirely. The verse had worked. The shadow was gone. But the cost, it had left a mark. Not a curse, but a connection. Something ancient had heard him, and now it watched through him. In the days that followed, the storm cleared. Margaret's cottage remained empty, but her journals were safe. Thomas spent his time sorting through them, piecing together her notes. She had known more than she let on, about Lewis, the verse, and the spiritual battles most never see. Hidden between the pages were prayers, protection rituals, and even a list of others like him, people who had glimpsed that deeper war between light and darkness. It turned out the verse wasn't just a weapon, it was a calling. Thomas didn't return to the pulpit, not in the traditional way. Instead, he wrote, quietly, privately, publishing stories and letters under a name no one recognized. His goal wasn't fame, it was preparation. There were others out there searching, like he had been, caught in confusion, haunted by shadows they couldn't explain. They needed to know they weren't alone. They needed to know there was a verse the enemy couldn't bear to hear. A verse that had been hidden, not because it was weak, but because it was so powerful it threatened everything darkness built. The church never found out what happened that night in Margaret's home. No police reports, no headlines, just whispers and silence. But in one small corner of the church library, a new page appeared, tucked neatly among the old C.S. Lewis sermons. Handwritten, faint ink, familiar verse, no title, and below it one final line: "To speak light into the darkness is to be seen by both." As Thomas lit a candle by his window that evening, the wind shifted gently outside, no longer threatening but watchful. Somewhere out there the battle still raged. But now one more voice stood ready to speak, and this time the darkness would tremble first.